to book early to get a cheaper rate, or to submit a paid abstract, you need to do it by the 15th of April. There's also a meeting called Why Am I a Critical Realist, with 3 people talking next Tuesday at the Institute. Are you all on Roy Basker's email list? You are? All of you are? Oh, well, I was going to say, if you'd like to keep up with the news about events and so on, if you email Roy Basker, r.basker@ioe.ac.uk, and ask him to put your name on his list, you'll get lots of news that way. Now, I was going to say that, you can also, when you book for the conference, as part of the ticket, get a subscription to the International Critical Realism Journal, which comes out 6 times a year, I think. So. Now, I was going to start by saying that, is this all right, this position, Rachel?
Perfect. Absolutely.
That critical realism is sometimes so obvious and sometimes so complicated. And it's introduced through a whole year of fortnightly sessions by Roy Basker on alternate Mondays, and I'm trying to skim through it, a lot of it, all in just a session. So if it doesn't make sense, don't worry too much. There's lots of ways to explore further these ideas. They're just an introduction. And I'm going to repeat some points that I've made in earlier sessions, but in this case apply them not to childhood or to rights specifically, but to ethics and research ethics. And one of the questions we're going to think about is whether justice and respect are universal principles or local ideas, and also about how critical realism can inform research ethics. And ethics is important in research as part of the methods of research. I went to a meeting yesterday when it was all about method, and the challenge of consent was how to get everybody to consent. And ethics is in some ways being rather hijacked into serving efficient research rather than also being challenging. Secondly, ethics can be an aim in research to conduct ethical and useful research and promote justice and respect. And a third way, by the way, have you all had these this list sent to you? Because
I couldn't open mine.
You couldn't open
No,
it?
so I couldn't print it.
Oh.
I could open it, but sorry, I couldn't print it. It just said it wouldn't work on my machine.
oh.
Which was a shame.
Email me and I'll try and get you
Okay.
another copy.
To
Yeah,
save
great,
you writing
thanks.
lots, but thirdly, critical realism is especially interested in ethics as the central concern in research in all social activities, and it's not really, so the ethics applies to research set in the broader society, which funds our work. People agree to take part in our work. If they didn't, we wouldn't be able to conduct research often. And the general public, the mass media, politicians debate our work. Research influences their lives, and they sometimes apply research. So that looking at ethics in the context of the moral and political society, so that ethics goes all the way through research. We wrote a book on ethics in research with children and young people in 10 chapters, dividing research into 10 stages, starting with first plans, moving on at the end to dissemination and implementation, and looking at all the ethical questions to raise at each stage of the research.
What was that book called?
It's the SAGE handbook, and it's called The Ethics of Research with Children and Young People, 2011. Now, as I've said in the previous sessions, critical realism isn't a rival to the social science. It's supposed to be their servant to help them to... critical realism argues that the social is always moral, that we all desire and work towards freedom or try to stop other people doing that. and we're constantly working out what we truly value, drawing on structures to guide our agency. And where I've referred to authors, there's a book list on the final screen. So sometimes attempts by objective researchers to try to delete morality from their work isn't so much a matter of not adding in morality, but denying what is really there and distorting their work. This is the critical realism idea. We can't avoid looking at the moral injustice, inequality, which are moral questions as well as method questions and topic questions. So the topics I'm going to just cover today are a bit about critical realism, different approaches to ethics, ideas about the origins of morality and the importance of childhood studies with this. And then, last time I didn't get onto the final slides, which were about the meld dialectic. So I've built this whole session mainly on the meld dialectic, and I'm going to work through the 4 moments, illustrating how they can be useful. And critical realism is a philosophy and a toolkit, and it helps us to clarify our work and increase its relevance. Now, there are different kinds of ethics, and I've identified 5 main different kinds. One is deontology. People say it means duty, but then other people say there was no Greek word for duty. However, it's about what we ought to do, and it's about looking backwards to traditions, laws, principles propounded by the great leaders of philosophical thought. In contrast, utilitarianism makes cost-benefit analyses and is consequentialist. It looks forward to the outcomes of research and tries to serve the greatest happiness of the greatest number. Now, both of these 2 approaches, which very much dominate American, United States research ethics, tend to be rather individualistic, rather abstract, rather depoliticised. Justice means keeping to the status quo, following the rules and laws now. And rather like virtue ethics and communitarianism, they are quite conservative, and they really serve the values of the powerful. Situation ethics is another approach, and while that offers valuable insights, it can risk relativism. It can say, well, there are no general ideas. We have to look at each specific context, the people involved, and sort out a specific answer. And finally, rights could be seen as the potential for working for greater equity, change, listening to protest from oppressed voices, negotiating conflict, redistribution, reform, and it is rather in contrast to the other more conservative approaches. Now, where does human morality come from, and should we comply with it or dissent? The first idea is that we are born naturally primitive, amoral, immoral. We have to be socialised, educated, and civilised into becoming moral beings. We have to be taught and forced to comply with moral rules. There's a great long tradition, for example, original sin in the Puritan tradition of religion. Freud believed in this, Durkheim, Talcott Parsons, Piaget, and Kohlberg, who following Piaget measured the moral stages, the gradual ascent towards the mature moral adult. And philosophers worried about how to get young children to overcome their passions and self-love, respect others, how teachers could sustain and cultivate a crust of civilization over the volcanic core of atavistic emotions in young children. In their twilight world, they have no knowledge of right or wrong, fairness or respect. And it does not begin to dawn until 7 or 8 years that there are reasons for rules. Does anybody know who Peters was? R.S. Peters. He founded the philosophy of education in the 60s, and he was the professor of the department here at the Institute. And his views morals have never been openly criticised or reneged on. And in fact, last year they were celebrating his centenary with great triumph that he'd founded their special discipline. So we have still a long way to go, because most people in the Institute haven't heard really of childhood studies. They are still very dominated by developmental psychology, which inevitably, if you start at zero at birth and slowly go upwards, there are going to be huge omissions and problems with the zero department. So, people though question, if morality is wholly cultural, we have to learn it, it's unnatural, where does it come from? How do we get the ideas? Why does it matter? And can it really benefit us, morality, if it really is against our nature? And there's the question, are things forbidden, are things immoral because they're forbidden, or are they forbidden because they're immoral? And the educational approach, the socialising one, tends to say things are immoral because they are forbidden. There's a long tradition of adults projecting their own egoism onto children. I expect you've heard of Piaget's famous experiments when he thought that children couldn't understand other people's minds, but actually the children were rather subtly reacting to Piaget's repeated questions and so on in ways they hoped would please him, and he seemed unaware of it. And the well-known Oedipus syndrome is so much blamed on the child who wants to murder his father and marry his mother. But when we think about where the origin of the Oedipus problems came from, it was the father who set it all up and lamed his son and abandoned him on a mountaintop, and so the sequence of events. So there's so much of this splitting and projection of immorality, amorality onto children by adults. Every day almost in the news it says, let's have a grown-up debate, doesn't it? As if, oh, we're not children, we politicians, we're grown-up adults. Now, the second alternative idea about the origins of morality are we're all born vulnerable, needy, attached, dependent. We're capable of suffering, and because of that, we're capable of pity and solidarity with others suffering. You could say, instead of original sin, or as well as, there's original virtue. There's a very early sense of justice and empathy. Even one-year-olds argue about, it's not fair. This passion for justice seems to come so early. And also there's interest in the power to hurt and to heal, when people do it to me and when I do it to others. And so instead of instruction, moral education from this line concentrates more on setting the example, practical agency, children learning through being, doing, relating, trusting human nature and conscience in ourselves and others, and this sensing, feeling, promoting shared human hopes and desires, which is both bodies, emotions, minds, relationships. And I expect you're all aware, aren't you, of the work of Kohlberg and Gilligan on children and the ethics of justice and care. Do you all know about that? Anybody not? Oh, right. Oh, well, briefly then, Kohlberg, following Piaget, decided there were, I think, six stages of moral development, starting with simply obeying, because mummy says so, going up to the Kantian ability to make general rules. And he did lots of research with thousands of children to prove that this was age-related. And Carol Gilligan was one of his researchers, and she began to question it a lot. And she started asking open questions and doing detailed interviews with 10-year-olds and found that they had very complex moral understanding, that the questionnaires were missing. And she spoke about the ethic of care as well as the ethic of justice that Kohlberg and Piaget were so interested in. Now, if we are more interested in embedded, personal, semi-natural morality, protest, dissent, resistance are vital moral responses. And Zygmunt Bauman and Hannah Arendt, have you come across their work? really important work on the Holocaust, have pointed out the dangers of complying and conforming, which most people do. And they respect the rare people who dare to protest and dissent when the state is becoming immoral, and they think that's the kind of highest form of morality. So there are two very different and contrasting views of morality and human nature. And the great value of ethnography in childhood studies is finding out why children do things that maybe look odd, even naughty, and find out that maybe they have quite sensible reasons for doing so, and that morality is much more complicated at all ages. I won't mention the dialectic before, but it's going to be much more through the session today, and how dialectic is about interaction and whether rivers shape the valley or the valley shapes the river, but also the city. Cities have to have rivers flowing through them and interact with the water and the rivers. There's transport and water and industry and all sorts of reasons. And so again, cities shape nature and nature shapes cities in this dialectic. Similarly, ethics, human agency and societies all interact, a bit like society with ethics as the river running through it, shaping the society, and the society shapes and reshapes the ideas about ethics. Secondly, dialectic is very much about contradiction and working to resolve them. Thirdly, dialectic is about movement. The 4 stages we'll talk on each push on to the next stage. And we are pushed on by our desire for justice and freedom. I mean, you can see that even when small children are put in the pushchair with their straps on, aren't they? And they absolutely protest often, don't they? And this desire to be free is, again, seems to be virtually innate, really, and to protest and to assert oneself and be the author of our own lives. Now, and another important thing about dialectic is constellations, and I'll discuss them later. Now, as you may well know, Socrates, Plato discussed the dialectic, which was the discussion of searches for truth. And then great breakthrough came with Hegel, who defined a 3-stage dialectic of thesis, antithesis, and then synthesis, resolution. But critical realism, while honouring very much this work, is a bit critical of it because it's so much about logic, reasoning ideas rather than practical living, being and changing society. And secondly, it ends with the resolution, synthesis, the end. Whereas critical realism argues we never reach this end. It's always something open and future. So instead of 3 stages, there are 4. They're called meld. I don't attach all that much meaning to moment, edge, level and dimension. But each of these stages, 1M, 2E, 3L, 4D, is distinctive and different, and that's what we're going to explore. So, we'll start with first moment, and that says non-identity, absence, and worry about the epistemic fallacy. It's about, when you're a researcher, standing back, suspending our stereotypes and our labelling, aiming to grasp reality, ontology, as independent of our own thought. If somebody walked into the room now, we would have been here before. If they walk out, we will still be here. It's to try and get that idea of the existence of things apart from our observing of it. And there's a long tradition in anthropology of aiming to do this. When European anthropologists sailed, and North American, sailed out to the strange island and looked at everything that's strange. And instead of trying to make sense of it in their own home terms, they tried to understand why people did things on their terms. So that's a very useful aspect of 1M. Respecting the topics, the events, the people in our research as unique, other, distinct. Trying to avoid the epistemic fallacy, which will be to collapse these things, people and events, into our own ideas, beliefs, classifications. and to reduce things into thoughts. And for example, to think of practical justice and respect simply as abstract ideas that don't really exist, but we think about them, or we use them as explanations. Ethics, in the epistemic fallacy, is merely words, claims, local social constructions, and this is something that we try to avoid. Yes.
Can I just ask you?
Yeah.
I was trying to find it just for the lecture, but I couldn't find it. There's a bit in the book where you mention about an epistemic fallacy conflating upwards, and I didn't know what that meant, but I couldn't find the page, I'm afraid.
Conflating upwards.
Yeah.
It might be that once we collapse things into thoughts, for instance, the botanist who goes around looking at flowers and plants and that, and then puts them all into a typology like their leaf shape and so on, or pins butterflies to cars and just classifies things by their shapes, and then that in a way redefines our relationship with nature. We're in control. There's going to be a bit more about that. And so it's not simply a matter of looking at a plant, it's the way we think about how humanity interacts with the cosmic systems and so on. And again, one aim is trying to be more respectful, reverential perhaps, about what we are trying to apprehend. I think that might be what I meant, I'm not sure. Now we have to accept absence as almost infinite. Presence is just a little ripple on this infinite ocean of absence, which is all the past, all the present, everything that's happening elsewhere, everything that might have happened and didn't. And an example is the monsoon that doesn't arrive, and so the crops fail and there's famine. This is a great absence of the life-giving rain and the diurnal seasons and so on. I was surprised to hear on the radio this week that colours only exist as wavelengths, frequencies and vibrations. I expect you all knew that, did you? Did you?
No.
Each colour's got its own vibrations. You did. So that when we look at a colour, our brains, eyes and everything are amazingly reinterpreting vibrations and frequencies in some astonishing way. And I thought it was a lovely example of meld, in that when we look at things, we think we know and understand, that, oh, that's yellow. And yet actually there's a deep, deep mystery that we scarcely understand, see or know. And again, that's part of the 1M, to try and hang on to this uncertainty, ignorance. So also to try to separate that intransitive being, the always a certain red has always the same number of vibrations apparently, whoever looks at it, wherever it is. Try to separate that from our perceptions of it, which will keep being transient and contingent. And also to think about children in the same way, that they are complex, little known, social, natural, moral beings. We can only see a tiny fraction of other people, and of ourselves indeed, can't we? And that they're in social structures of time, space, cause that are constantly changing them, changing us. Also to see concepts or realities like justice or freedom or solidarity in a similar way, and to say, there is a core thing, a reality, justice, that is somehow recognisable to practically everybody in the world, especially when people are being unjust to you, when you feel really angry about it or upset about it. But also to see that this great idea is interpreted, understood, practiced, exercised in infinite different ways around the world. People often want to put other people's justice and freedom before their own, but they choose to. There's a difference between choosing to and being forced to. I mentioned the semiotic triangle last time, and how, according to critical realists, so much research is about 1 and 2, the signifier, the concept of ethics, and the signifier of the words about ethics, deontology, utilitarianism, and so on, forgetting the referent, the real practical experience and enactment of ethics that's going on nearly all the time. And I mentioned the constant conjunctions and Hume's idea that we should only look at things we can understand through our five senses. So we would look at objects falling and look for patterns between them or power within the objects, as Aristotle believed. And then think we had explained why and how they're falling and how they relate. And that's a bit like covariate analysis. However, in contrast to that, critical realism argues that is only the superficial surface of ethics, the empirical, and for example, with consent and research ethics, the consent form, the sensed experience. Then there's the actual, the people and objects, and the way they negotiate consent. But underneath that is the real. I did my PhD on consent and parents' consent to children's heart surgery, and looked at how this was an intellectual, emotional journey that the parents went through, from shock, rejection, no, I'm not having surgery on my new baby, to doubt, uncertainty, growing trust, realisation that to leave the heart untreated would be worse than having surgery, to getting courage and becoming committed. And this is the kind of reality of consent inside people's minds, and their realisation, if they are pushed into things against their consent or unwillingly or uncertainly, their great awareness of it, even if they don't actually say anything. There's all sorts of things going on at the real level of power and human interactions and decisions and voluntariness.
It's interesting you talk about consent with the latest thing about in Belgium, about assisted dying for children.
Yes.
It was on the Moral Maze last night.
It was, wasn't it? Yes.
Yeah.
Then none of them seem to realise the difference between children and adults and people who actually are dying, who have such different knowledge and understanding.
Because his argument, the Belgian doctor, was that the children who have got terminal illnesses are usually much more mature.
Yes, I found that.
Yeah.
Yes. I interviewed 120 children aged 8 to 15 about when they were old enough to consent to major surgery, and it included some work on heart lung transplants for cystic fibrosis children. And the understanding of the children had no relation to their age, it was their experience. And you could say that's about the reality of our lives, our understanding, our decisions and our actions, whether we know what's going on or not, has an awful lot to do with our social context, our past experience, all sorts of deep things that you can't see by simply looking at the surface and the present and the visible. So the ontology of the real being of human morality also includes the possibility of naturalism. Roy wrote a book on that, which is all about how the methods of the life sciences, which see and touch and handle objects and are supposed to be about things, are not identical to social science methods, but they apply. There is a unity between the two, and that both the kinds of science deal with both things and ideas. Also, the sort of depth of 1M, of looking at a child or at justice and the other principles, is the four-planar social being that you mentioned before, which is bodies in relation to nature, learning from our feelings, our gut feelings of pity or outrage against an atrocity or sympathy or generosity, interpersonal relations, social structures and how they clamp down on ethical living or open it up, and our inner being. And really, it's about not just acting morally, it's about feeling and trying to be and identify with what we are saying and doing. Right, now having done 1M, the standing back, 2E, I think is more about intervening, acting, but it's about very much about absence, which is missing from Hegel. There's absence in need, the thing I want isn't here, or in suffering, looking for the relief, ignorance, contradiction, injustice and slavery, all of them about absences, and wanting to absent the absences into finding the relief or the answer, to negate negatives and turn them into positives. So, according to critical realism, absence is an infinite push-pull power. Absence is like the future, it's dragging us from the past into the future, it's a great vacuum. Now, part of critical realism is a critique of the whole of Western philosophy in 5,000 years. I won't go into it all, but there's a book, one of Roy's books is Plato, etc. And Plato, a powerful lawgiver, passed a veto: we must never look at what is not, only at what is. And that influences research so powerfully today. People say, well, where is the evidence? And somebody said to me yesterday, oh, it's only theoretical about climate change, meaning not only was it not credible, but it was probably not true. So theory can be often quite a dismissive concept to many people. If Plato and other philosophers veto the absent, the unseen, the alternative, it means that the world is so packed, there's no room, there's no space for movement, for change, for alternatives. Roy argues that philosophy, Western philosophy, is very much shaped for the elite and the powerful, even today, and it's against change. It supports the status quo on the whole. And it's about Tina, Mrs. Thatcher's phrase, there is no alternative. When, of course, there are alternatives, but when powerful people say there is no alternative, and critical realism says, but there always is an alternative. Also, monovalence, the single value of of presence and the ignoring of absence, which critical realism tries to overcome. Now, I've showed these little pictures last time, but I'm going to draw out a slightly different meaning of them this time. It took me ages to understand this. I think I understand it now, and I hope it's clear. But it's about the important difference between difference and change. And difference is to keep the status quo, the power as it is. And change is about transforming, upheaval, reform. So, Plato and difference is the one and the many. So that when we look at things in research, in botany and childhood and ethics, we try to identify differences and typologies. Like Piaget's and Kohlberg's stages of development, you know, there's the pre-operational stage, I believe, isn't there? And there's the latency stage and so on. And children are grouped into these age groups, which with sort of self-fulfilling surveys. So it's kind of mathematical, scientific, predictive activity, which is the most popular and well-funded kind of research that we have. Hello. And it puts the detached researcher in control, and it fixes the data. It avoids the process of change. It classifies, right? Now, in contrast to that, critical realism is about real change, which is about transformation, more than difference, such as if you two changed where you're sitting, which will be difference. Change is about the one and the other. How do we function, emerge, and change into the other, and yet remain the same? Because the same person sustains the change. And I gave the example before of the girl who learns to read. So before, she was very dependent and had close relationships with people who read to her. When she learned to read, she had new skills, new independence, new relationships with other people. She was a different girl, and yet she was the same girl. And this idea of transformation and change, critical realists argue, is a fairly new take on philosophy that's been rather vetoed in the past. So this involves also a different role for the researcher. We are then more engaged in the sustained dynamic process of change. And instead of having a standard questionnaire with all the preset questions and answers we tick, we ask open-ended questions, and we're not sure what's going to happen, and we're taken by surprise and have to think on our feet and so on, and interact with the people that we're researching. So the one and the many, this classifying, does tend towards postmodern relativism, because it argues that if there are too many local varied examples of justice, in some societies it's just that women always do the washing up, that's justice, and in others it's just that men and women share these duties, that's justice. You know, people say, well, there's no such thing really as justice, it's such a floating thing. What really matters is all the different examples, the empirical and the actual. There's no underlying real causal power of justice. And the argument that justice is a Western idea, so it's irrelevant in many countries, means that morality doesn't matter much. We can live perfectly well without it, or with such different versions that why have any? In contrast, the idea of the one and the other, the constant idea of justice, which also has many, many different ways of being expressed, interpreted, and enacted, but is still a deep, agreed core, means that justice is very important to everyone, every society, in some form or other. And so the one essential ideal of justice sustains the varying many other aspects of it, and is also refined and developed. We've seen it, say, with women's rights and children's rights, that people have come to quite new, over the last century, ideas of what is justice to different groups of people, extending it. To go on a bit more about difference and justice, the example of difference is when a failing school is closed and then it's reopened, more or less as the same school, but with a newer uniform, a new head teacher, and a new name. So there's a superficial difference, but a lot of the problems underneath remain unaddressed. Now, change would involve looking at people's motives, transforming, emergence, risks, loss, gain. And I did a study as a writer in residence of a school in Devon that had been real mayhem, and the head teacher had left with a nervous breakdown, and a new head came, and over 5 years, sort of everybody in the school worked to transform the school until it became sort of award-winning school for good behaviour and for involving everyone. And they had all sorts of original ideas, things like bully busters and guardians and so on, that they introduced in order to keep the peace, prevent conflict, have conflict resolution, and live more inclusive and enjoyable lives together. But that was transformation and change. Everybody in the school had to change in themselves and in their relationships and in their idea of what the school was. And the neighbourhoods had a different idea, and lots of old people came in every day to share lunch with the children. All sorts of new things happened to transform the school. Ethics and power. Power 1 and 2 are very important into E, which is about transformation, because the whole movement is towards power 1, creative, emancipating, transforming power. Everyone uses their energy together towards voluntariness and respect and justice, away from power 2, destructive, coercive, oppressive power, where a few people control the majority. Now, power and absence are both interrelated, and the ills of power 2 are part of the impetus for change towards power 1, to escape from the ills of power 2, to absent and negate them and achieve new freedoms that are currently absent but are hoped to be realised in the future. Of course, absence also includes the invisible. And have you read Luke's book on power. It's very short, the earlier one, the 1985 one in the library, and there are 3 forms of power. He says they're all power 2, negative power. But there's the obvious power that if somebody wants to walk out of the room and I try to stop them, you can see that. That's power 1. Power 2 is if somebody wants to walk out and I try to persuade them not to. It's more subtle and it can be more kind of a bit more powerful if it works. But the third one is when it doesn't occur to people that they can walk out of the room. There is such constraint. And Nicholas Rose has written a really good book, Governing the Soul, about how people internalise, mothers internalise the idea that they've got to stimulate their children who've always got to be clean, eager and well behaved. And they blame themselves if they don't do it. And that is the governing, the power that invades people's souls. And he argues it's the most powerful kind of power and the least visible, the most hidden. And that's why, again, it's so important to look beyond the actual and the empirical down to the real levels of where power really is going on and how it's working.
What was the name of that author?
Stephen Luke's.
Was that the second one, or was it just...
He did the 3 kinds of power, yeah.
Nicholas Rose?
Oh, sorry, yeah,
Yeah.
thank you, Rachel, yeah. Nikolaus, Governing the Soul, 89. Now, the next thing about change and so on is closed and open systems. And we hardly ever have closed systems when only one power is working. I mean, even gravity is countered by birds and planes, isn't it? And so instead of a single closed system, there's nearly always open systems. There's gravity, but there's also jet engines, bird flight, winds, air currents, all sorts of things going on. And these different powers counter each other. And the important thing in the social sciences is not to expect this kind of 100% outcome, so that if we don't have just societies, people say, oh, justice doesn't exist, it's not attainable. But to see that justice is countered by inequality, economics, politics, droughts, floods, all sorts of things, powers, are interacting with and countering justice. It doesn't mean that justice is any less powerful, great or universal. It just means that it's much more complicated in its interactions with all these other great, powerful, universal powers. So that these powers in open systems are determining powers, they're influential. Our ideas of justice in our society are very influential, but they're not determinists, they don't wholly control all our activities, or we would have a perfectly law-abiding society. Now, after these first 2, the third one is 3L. And in some way, here, this is a bit like Hegel's third synthesis. It's reaching a new totality after the intervention and the changes, like the school that was changing. After 5 years or so, a completely new school had emerged, and all the children and all the staff within it, in a way, interacted in different ways than they would have 5 years earlier. So there was a new totality. But the important thing in critical realism is to say that totalities aren't universal. A book is a totality, a word is a totality, a letter is. And they're always open to other totalities, like a book is always waiting for a reader and that interaction. So you've got the child within the family, within the school, within the community. And all of these are totalities interacting with each other. And similarly, ethical principles such as justice or respect or solidarity are all totalities. And in some ways, of course, they are in conflict, in that freedom, you could say, is a selfish individualism, and solidarity is willingness to put other people first, or at least equally. And the point about morality is that it is definitely not simple. It's this complex interacting and negotiating of these really precious principles, each of which can't just stand alone, but have to be modified in relation to the others. There's also a lot on the concrete, universal, singular, and this is another very important answer to people who argue that justice can only have one format. This is to say that there is this concrete, this real, rounded, non-abstract thing, justice, that is a great cause of power in the world. But there's also respect for the singular individual, everyone, and their particular needs. So all human beings share a great deal of the same needs and interests, but we also have unique ones as well. And it's this dialectic, this interaction between the two, that is so important. They use, I'm not all that sure about this concept, and you might like to discuss it. They use the word constellation of, several stars in a pattern together. But of course that's only from our perspective, and some of these stars are zillions of miles apart from each other, so they're not actually really in a constellation, are they? However, critical realists like talking about things being set in constellations. And I put the compass there because there's all sorts of different opposites all interacting and working together. And I put a few of them there, like egoism and altruism. We have to be partly egoistic and look after ourselves, but also altruistic and look after others. And a lot of dilemmas come with how to balance these two. And the same with all the others. They both kind of threaten and contradict and infringe on one another, but they also enrich and define each other, are realised through their interaction, and can't be separated. You can't have injustice without justice. There just wouldn't be such a concept or an entity. So these opposites, child, parent, and another, only exist in their opposition. But they are irreducible. You can't collapse the one into the other. Yet in some ways they may overlap as well. Do you want to give me any examples?
Is a teacher student like that? They only exist in relation to each other?
Yes. And also they may well overlap because the teacher may be learning from the student as well as the student from the teacher. Any other examples?
Can you say a little bit more, Priscilla, because
Yeah.
you say their constellation interaction struggle
Yeah.
beyond dichotomies.
Yes.
Yeah, so
Yes.
is the idea of constellation that actually there's more than just two kind of opposing forces in operation, but it's actually, if you think about the metaphor, there's a number of different things in operation together
Yes.
in a particular relationship.
Yeah, and they're held together. You can't collapse one into the other, but they can't exist without the other, and they're in constant tension and interaction. So that you have to say the personal and the political, but you can't have those two just in abstraction apart from, say, economics or debates about justice and freedoms and so on. And by seeing them as sort of powerful things or bases, and almost like magnets of opposite yet attraction, this kind of overcomes the very simplistic dichotomy, because so many people think, oh, it's either or, whereas in critical realism it's and. Justice and injustice. And neither is absolutely complete. They're always qualifying each other and changing each other. And that's the interesting part of doing research about ethics, to look at it in such a complicated and realistic way rather than an idealistic, abstract way. Does that make a bit more sense?
It seems to me that there's two different things. I mean, one is trying to move beyond dichotomies to see them both and, so both egoistic and altruistic at the same time, and then saying, well, actually, constellation is about the interaction between egoism, altruism, and reason. So
Yes.
a constellation, how I understood it, was actually broadening out and thinking across those dichotomies as
Yes.
well as the both and.
Yes, so it's not just egoism, altruism, it's
Egoism, altruism, and
justice,
just-
injustice,
yes.
and so on. And these tensions and pulling apart and understanding together. It's nearly halfway through. I haven't got that many more slides because I was hoping we'd do a lot more discussion today. Would you like to have a break now and for about 10 minutes and then we'll